I'd like to welcome everyone today to our webinar entitled Ecosystem Services on Forest and Agricultural Lands of Maryland. My name is Andrew Kling. I'm a faculty extension assistant with the Woodland Stewardship Education Program at the University of Maryland Extension at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. We're located in Washington County in Keedysville, Maryland. If you're familiar with the state of Maryland, we're about a half an hour south of the city of Hagerstown. With me today is Bob Tjaden, who will be presenting the bulk of the information today. If you've been with us before for our webinars, we are happy to have you back. If you're new to our webinar series, we have a little bit of information and housekeeping to go through first before I turn things over to Bob. We hold these webinars on an intermittent basis. We try to do 3 or 4 a year. This is our first one for 2015. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about our webinar series, we invite you to join our email notification list. The easiest way to do that is to send an email to listserv@listserv.umd.edu, or you can contact me directly at akling1@umd.edu. And we asked people to register through Eventbrite for today's webinar, and we usually do that as a way of finding out how many people are interested in the webinar. And we limited it to 100 people, and that's mostly a bandwidth issue on our end more than anything else. So the first 100 people who log on today get to attend the program, but that doesn't mean that no one else gets to see it, because all of our webinars, including this one, are recorded, and we then post them on our YouTube channel. So if you discover that you don't have time to sit through the entire hour today, or if you discover that this is something that someone else might be interested in, we will have it available for you at youtube.com/c/umd.fse, and we also make it available through our website at extension.umd.edu/woodland. And the Woodland Stewardship Education Program website has a lot more information than just our webinars. There's information about our signature programs, Maryland Woodland Stewards and the Woods in Your Backyard. There's publications about invasive species, timber tax information, wood energy. There's a wide variety of information there. So we invite you to take some time and wander through that at your leisure. As we go through the webinar, there are times when people have questions, and we invite you to type that in the chat box. That's on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. We try to get to the questions during the presentation if possible, but if not, we usually build in time at the end for questions and answers. And on occasion, there are questions that come up that are a little involved. We don't have time to get to them, or some people end up with questions and they forget to ask it because we move on to something else, and they say, "Oh, I should have asked that during the presentation." You can always drop me a line at akling1@umd.edu, and we'll get the information back to you as soon as possible. Now, before I turn things over to Bob, we have a few poll questions to go through. Just 5 questions today to get an idea of the demographics, people who are joining us, and find out a little bit about your background. Firstly, we'd like you to share with us why you're interested in this topic, what your background is, if you're a landowner, a forester, environmental educator, etc. Give us a chance to find out who our audience is, and you can see the results coming up. We'd also like you to tell us where you are. We had Eventbrite registrations from all across the country, and in some cases, I know we had at least one international registrant. So we'd like to find out where folks are from, and it looks like it's mostly from the mid-Atlantic states right now. See where people are logging in from. It's always interesting to see the demographics. Moving on to the next one, I'd like you to tell us what your knowledge of ecosystem services is before we start all of this. It's a topic that was new to me before we got started, so I'd like to find out what everyone else thinks about it. And it looks like there's a varying amount of knowledge in our audience, so that'll be good. Next to last one, are you engaged in any educational programs in the area of ecosystem services? And this is one of the reasons we do these webinars, to find out what's out there, what people are doing, and if they have any programs that might be improved by the information that we're offering today. And finally, does your state or region or municipality have any programs going on concerning ecosystem services? And once again, we like to find out what people think, and in this case it looks like the majority of people aren't sure if the programs actually exist, and this is one of the reasons why we do these webinars, to give people a chance to find out what they might learn about ecosystem services, particularly today. Okay, I am going to go ahead and close these polls, and we'll get ready to move on to Bob's presentation. I'll tell you a little bit about Bob. Bob is an extension specialist and professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, in the Department of Environmental Science and Technology. He's been at the university for 26 years now. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Wildlife Management from the University of Maine at Orono, a Master's of Forestry from Duke University in Forest Economics, and a PhD from the University of Maryland in Natural Resource Policy. Recently, he's been focusing his research on socioeconomic topics related to ecosystem services and forestry in Maryland. He also teaches 2 courses at the university, one called Ecosystem Service and Integrated Analysis, and another one entitled Applied Forestry Techniques. So what I'm going to do now is get ready to mute my microphone and turn things over to Bob, and he'll be presenting his findings today. And so, Bob, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, Andrew. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Really appreciate you taking time during your lunch to listen to this topic. Basically, this is a research topic that I undertook about 3 years ago, and really, I mean, the formal title is Ecosystem Services on Forest and Agricultural Lands of Maryland. And what we did is a survey of Maryland tree farmers and agricultural landowners, those that are more what I call the commodity farmers type in the state. And we compared the attributes, a lot of the different characteristics between these two, and I'll explain a little bit more to you as we go along. And I'll give you more information where you can get the final report at the end, but I'll also put it up here right under my title and my email address. So feel free to go to my website, or even just shoot me an email and I can send you the final report. But I thought it would be a good way to start the webinar with, I see a lot of you have a pretty good understanding of ecosystem services, but there were also a group that weren't too sure about this. So anyway, I just set the foundation and explain that ecosystem services are a condition and processes through which the natural systems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life and the environment. I mean, these are basically our building blocks that we utilize every day for survival, and also the functions that keep our ecosystem and our environment functioning through all the different cycles that are there. They maintain biodiversity and production of ecosystem goods, such as those that we're familiar with, what I'll call a lot of market goods, such as seafood, forage, timber, biofuels, natural fiber, pharmaceuticals, and many industrial products. There are also services such as wildlife habitat, clean air, clean water, flood control, carbon sequestration, and pollination that are provided. Now, the majority of these services are non-market goods and services. So in other words, there's no active markets that you can go and actively engage in an exchange of finances or money with these. There are some that are market goods and services, as you can see on the second bullet there. You know, we're all familiar with those markets, you know, the seafood, the timber, so on and so forth. But when it comes to wildlife habitat, there's a little bit action in the clean air area of reference to carbon sequestration, but very few markets are currently available. Now, there are really 4 types of ecosystem services that were classified by the Millennium Assessment. And the Millennium Assessment really occurred about in the early 2000s, the turn of this century. And what happened is the group of leaders, really leaders within the environmental natural resource area, got together and said, we really need to start to address this topic of ecosystem services and put some framework on it, develop a foundation from which to build upon. And what they came up with were really 4 general categories. And you can see them here: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural, and supporting services. And the provisioning, are those that we're most familiar with, products that we obtain, the food, the water that we drink, the fuel wood, our fiber and biochemicals. The regulating services basically are those that benefit and those that obtain from the regulation of our ecosystems. For example, forests in general really kind of regulate the overall climate of the world and of our particular continent. They also regulate water. They provide water purification systems. The cultural services really are non-monetary benefits from these ecosystem services, and a lot of them are such as spiritual, religious, a lot of recreation, aesthetics, and educational. Very important services that many times we don't really factor into this category, to these particular ecosystem service categories. And then last but not least are the supporting services, those necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services. These are the ones that really keep the ecosystem service connected and functioning. A lot of the nutrient cycles that occur, the formation of soils, the mycorrhiza, all the bacteria that are within the soil to keep the soil forming on an annual basis, and also primary production. Those that the marshes really provide for the basic production of a lot of the foods that we do eat. Now, valuation is not all financial. But those many times we do focus on how do we evaluate and put dollar values on these particular ecosystem services for the market. There are other ways that from a non-market good that we can do this. But anyway, what I did is laid out 3 approaches that are used in general to estimate the dollar value of ecosystem services. And those 3 are pretty generic: market price, circumstantial evidence, and surveys. So the market price is really the revealed willingness that we pay for these ecosystem services. There's many different methods, but the market price is basically what we pay in the market. Productivity, of how do these services increase the productivity or affect the productivity of, say, a water treatment plant, or of a farmer irrigating his or her crops, what the quality of that water is. The Hedonic Method, those that are involved in land use planning or urban planning understand that the hedonic is used primarily in the real estate area to kind of assess what the value or the surrounding environment, such as the woods, could be a wetland or a farm or a stream, what kind of impact they have on the price of particular real estate. Pretty solid project there. And then travel cost method is used a lot by the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on assessing what people pay to go to certain places to recreate. The other is the circumstantial evidence, the imputed willingness to pay. And this is one where a lot of these would be from the damage cost avoided as a result of a particular activity, replacement or substitute costs. And a lot of these I put in a category like IPM, Integrated Pest Management. That's a substitute cost for the natural pest control that the environment provides. Or the other would be just water treatment facilities. They are all replacement costs that the forest provide for us in clean water. And the other really is kind of what we're going to be speaking about today is the expressed willingness to pay. And what we do here is several different methods, but those are most common are what's called contingent valuation, and we'll go through those in quite a bit of detail today. And the other is conjoint choice, which is really you're forcing folks to make a decision based on two different choices. So when we did this survey, we completed it back in about 2013, and there were many other folks that were involved in this with me, and I just want to make sure I give them credit. Richard Pritzlaff from Biphilia Foundation, he was involved in this particular project. And then I had two PhD students in our college in agricultural resource economics, Dan and Seth, that really helped in doing a lot of the econometric modeling. And Dr. Anna Albernini helped in a lot of just the model development to kind of really think about some of these econometric models. So there's a lot of folks that were really up front helping with these. And the funding for this project came from, a good portion came from our agricultural experiment station in the college. We used USDA hatch funds, and also the Biphilia Foundation provided some funding for this. Okay, now a little background I'll go into to kind of give you a context from which we decided to do this. Forest land and agricultural lands, wetlands and marine have really been increasingly recognized for their ecosystem services. It's becoming more of a common phrase, a common terminology, and nationwide there's an interest in ecosystem services in developing markets and establishing a payment for ecosystem service programs. And what I'm going to do just for economy of words, I'm just going to use PES throughout the rest of the presentation to denote payment for ecosystem services. And there's a general assumption that landowners, the general public, and many of us in the professional natural resource area and environmental area know what ecosystem services are and their functions. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of our findings there. But the other part of the background here, I just want you to understand there's really few markets. Most of these services are public goods, and that means they don't belong to anybody. They're public goods. You know, the marine resources, the fisheries the clean air, the clean water, nobody owns. They're public goods, and they're non-market goods and services. So that creates a little bit of a challenge as we start to deal with this as a commodity. And there's little incentives currently for landowners to enhance their ecosystem services. Now, there have been some put in place, but in general, very few incentives for landowners to do this. And it makes it difficult for policymakers to put public funds to fund a lot of these public goods that are privately produced on agricultural and forest lands. And this is what I do. I call this the free rider syndrome. Why would I, myself as an individual, want to put money into a public good when it doesn't, I mean, it benefits me, but it benefits the entire society as a whole. So it gets into the whole study of dynamics, of which part of my class that I teach. I help students understand this whole public good service type issue around policy and understanding what the free rider syndrome was. And I always used, it's like, why would I be willing to buy a Prius, for example, to clean so that we can have clean air when in fact my neighbor's going to do it, or my neighbor's down the street? They're contributing to this, so why should I? And I think that's one of the challenges we have as policymakers, is how to engage people in a lot of these public goods and services when they don't own it, but they partake and they benefit from a lot of these goods and services. Anyway, that's called the free rider syndrome. The production, and most of you probably know this, the production of ecosystem services largely occurs on private land, because most of the land in the United States is privately owned. And here in the state of Maryland, 78% of the forest land is in private ownership. To help manage and sustain these services, landowners really need to understand their values both environmentally and financially. So we don't have to put a dollar on everything, but I think folks and the public in general and landowners need to understand the values that are there environmentally. They need to have programs that are there to enhance and protect these ecosystem services. Cross-year programs, just general programs of awareness, and a lot of educational programs need to be developed around ecosystem services. And the landowners really need markets and to be established to encourage the management of their land to enhance these services. These are pretty much the background. The overall kind of the framework for this, the purpose of this study really was to identify factors that drive participation in a program for ecosystem service and determine the extent to which tree farmers and farmers are knowledgeable about ecosystem services. Now I use the word tree farmers, you see it's in capital. What it is, tree farmers are a recognized entity nationwide. They are organized, they are recognized by the American Forest Foundation as forest landowners who have really went above and beyond the call of duty to manage their property. And in order to become a tree farmer, you have to comply with certain high standards of certification where inspectors go in and maintain the integrity of your forest. And once you comply with a lot of these standards and have a forester come in and certify that you have a formal forest stewardship or forest management plan, then you become a tree farmer. So that is a formal entity. That's why it's in capital, just so that you understand what that's about. And the other is, until recently, back in 2013 and before that, there were very few studies in this area to look at the dynamics of landowners reference to ecosystem services. There have been other studies done in the past that really focus more on motivational factors for landowners and farmers to engage in conservation and cost-share programs. And a lot of those studies were called diffusion of information. And those type of studies really proved that, educational is critical, knowledge motivates landowners to engage in a lot of these conservation type programs. But until recently, there have been very few studies in this area on ecosystem service and econometric type studies, except for Duke University, the Defenders of Wildlife, and the Nature Conservancy. They both, all three, undertook projects prior to this, with Duke University really studying farmers in North Carolina and kind of quantifying their willingness to participate in an ecosystem service program that would enhance the red wolf habitat. The Defenders of Wildlife coordinated with Duke as well out to California, where they did a similar study with ranchers, and ranchers' willingness to participate in a program to enhance wildlife habitat on rangelands in California. And the Nature Conservancy most recently did a study that really kind of tested landowners' knowledge about ecosystem services in general to see if they even understood this term. And in general, they said no. They don't understand what ecosystem services are. Matter of fact, we may need to change the name to something else. And I think they were like, some of the terms that they were talking about were, I'm just looking here, nature's of value or nature's benefit. But terms such as ecosystem services, natural capital, Earth's capital, the general public doesn't understand or relate to. But terminologies like nature's value or nature's benefits, the general public understands those. So our research objectives were to determine whether tree farmers and farmers in Maryland are knowledgeable about ecosystem services. Attitudes towards participation in a payment for ecosystem service program. We don't have a payment for ecosystem service program in the state of Maryland, but this was to test to see if the state would, what the attitudes and the attributes would be of the landowners for participation. How the demographics and the geographical characteristic affect willingness to participate in these programs. The demographics being age, education, income, location in the state, things of that sort. We'll go into more of those details. Other objectives we had are how financial payments, contract lengths, and the agency administering a payment for ecosystem service program would affect participation, and if there were any possible differences in responses between tree farmers and farmers. Now, the methods that we employed were, we really looked at the two similar surveys that were done in North Carolina and California by both Duke and the Defenders of Wildlife, and we use that as kind of the basis for our survey development. We call that the survey instrument, and we learn from some of their successes and challenges. But basically, our survey instrument was a mail survey, and we had about 33 questions. And we broke up the survey into really 3 different sections. The first dealt with land use, where we asked them basic questions on how many acres do you land? How many acres do you own? Do you rent your property? How long have you owned it? The other really was the meat of the survey, which focused on ecosystem services, which I'll present to you, and a lot of the personal information, the demographic, their age, their income, educational, their overall education. Now, we opted out. You may say, why we went with the old mail survey. Well, originally we were going to do a telephone survey and try to get about 500 to 600 completed surveys, but talking to others that really deal with surveys on a daily basis, one of the challenges that we have today is most people have cell phones, and the landlines are diminishing significantly in the United States. We could do a telephone survey, and we could obtain telephone numbers, and we could have really been successful in that, but we thought we'd bias our information because we would not be reaching a lot of the younger demographic, the younger folks who no longer have landlines. So once again, we went with a mail survey. But this, from a survey methodology perspective, the telephone surveys are a real challenge for the future. The questions were really 3 in general. They were on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, with like 1 being you don't agree with the statement, or 5 you strongly agree or disagree. Contingent valuation and related questions, and the conjoint choice, and you'll see what those are. The mailing, we worked with the American Forest Foundation. We were able to obtain the Maryland Tree Farm mailing list from them, and roughly it was about 1,000 tree farmers that we obtained, and what we did is we filtered it down to about 878 for multiple landowners owning the same piece of property. So we just wanted to make sure it just went to one person that owned that particular property, because some of them are owned in family units. And then we went to the Maryland Property View, which is basically the property tax database in Maryland, and we obtained names for those individuals that owned farms that were 100 acres or more and did not own any forest land, which is a real challenge. But we wanted to make sure that our 2 different groups were definitely unique. So the farmers that we surveyed did not own any forest land. We filtered these names and addresses for duplicate owners because one farmer may own 5, 6 farms. So we just wanted to make sure we got just one farmer as opposed to multiple. We focused on the farmers versus the properties. And then we stratified those by percent farms per county. So for example, in Queen Anne's County, it may be that the county is a 12% farmland. So we made sure that 12% of the samples went to that particular county. And what we originally tried to do is have an equal distribution. We wanted to do about 2,000 for our population, but since we only had about 878 tree farmers, we tried to get a similar amount of farmers, but as it wound up, we wound up with about 1,108 farmers' names and addresses to survey. So our total population was a little under 2,000, 1,986. And what we did is we worked with Mason-Dixon Polling Group. You may have heard of this group or seen them on TV. They do a lot of the political polling during election times. And at the base, you'll take notice when they say, you know, so-and-so is ahead by so many points, and Mason-Dixon polling figured the margin of error for this is 5 points or something. So we worked with them to really refine the survey and contracted with them to mail it out. The total cost of this, those of you may wonder or interested or do this, the total cost was about $21,500. The actual contract we had with Mason-Dixon was around, I think it was around $10,000, maybe $12,000 to do this. And then the rest was involved with helping pay some people and printing costs and things of that sort. The methods, we pre-tested this, the survey instrument, the survey at 2 different times, which was extremely valuable. We mailed the survey April 2nd, 2012. When we mailed the survey out, there was an introductory letter that was sent. We gave them a self-addressed stamped envelope to return the survey, but we also gave them the option to go online and complete the survey online. We did ask them to complete all these surveys by April 15th, so we had a short turnaround time. We use what's called the Dillman's Total Design Method, and here, just to kind of set the framework so you understand the validity of this survey, you know, you send out introductory letters 2 weeks prior to the survey. You know, you obtain validation letters from key organizations so that those people who are receiving the survey really know that the organization that they recognize is supporting this. And in this case, we received a letter from the chairman of the Maryland Tree Farm Committee telling tree farmers that this survey is good. It's important for them to take the time to fill it out. And also the Maryland Farm Bureau did the same, but they opted to put it into their newsletter for their constituents. We followed up the survey with postcards and, of course, self-addressed stamped envelope. Now, the methods that we used to do the analysis were really two. For the contingent valuation, the CV stands for contingent valuation. We used a probit regression analysis, and for the conjoint choice, we used a logit regression analysis. This is where I brought in the PhD students from agricultural resource economics to help with these analysis. So some of the basic results here, we had about 536 surveys returned, and only about 516 were completed and usable. So we only used surveys that were completed. If somebody left a question unanswered, we didn't include that. And we had about 34 with wrong addresses. So overall, we had about a 28% response rate, which we were happy with. And much to our surprise, we only had 47, or about 9%, complete the survey online. We were hoping that would be a little bit higher, but it wasn't. And the distribution of the return surveys reasonably followed the stratified mailing, reflecting the percent farms and forest per county. So we thought we really had a good representative sample of our population. Now, I just want to point out one thing here. We did receive, and I bring this to your attention, and those of you that are in Maryland may understand what was going on back in 2012, but we got one letter of refusal. It was well written, very productive, proactive from the farmer. And they made a statement that they no longer trust the University of Maryland research efforts due to the lawsuit filed by the University of Maryland Law School and the Waterkeepers Alliance. So what was going on at that time, and the reason why I'm telling you this is because it does impact survey results, and you have to understand the dynamics of what's going on at the time. But when we sent the survey out, about the same time this was all going on, and it both hit at the same time, unfortunately. But basically, the Waterkeepers Alliance worked with the University of Maryland Law School in filing a lawsuit against a large poultry producer in southern part of the Eastern Shore for water pollution issues. And it hit the paper. It was a big time concern. And the University of Maryland in general, particularly our college, being a college of agriculture and natural resources, took a big hit because the farming community really looks to us to provide support for them. And they felt that we were taking them to court and being counterproductive for what the relationships were that we had in the past. But what they did not understand is University of Maryland Law Institute is an entirely different institute that's not attached to our college, to our campus at all. So anyway, I bring that to your attention because there was a lot of this going on, and at the same time there were two large agricultural landowners on the Eastern Shore who had lawsuits from the federal government for noncompliance on certain types of programs. And that hit the paper at the same time. So you can't bring these things back. The surveys, once you send them out, they're out. But I do think this particular situation and situations that were occurring affected some of our results, as you'll find out. Some of the general descriptive statistics are as follows. 56% of our respondents were tree farmers. The average acres owned of both farmers and tree farmers was about 204 acres. We asked them, what percent of your annual income comes from your land? And the overall response was about 15%. 81% of our respondents were male. The average age about 67. Very well-educated group of respondents. 51% had a college degree, a BS degree or greater, which surprised us. The ownership structure, 81% were in private family ownerships as opposed to LLCs or some type of corporate type ownership. So 81% were in private, and 41% of our respondents' annual household income was $100,000 or more. A couple interesting points here. 43% of our respondents participated in conservation cost share programs in the past, which kind of surprised me. And I just got done doing a project with forest landowners in the forest industry in the state of Maryland, and we asked the forest landowners that we surveyed. It was probably 3,000 that we asked this question. There, only 30% have ever participated in a cost share program, which I thought and many others thought was relatively low. I would have thought that it had been much higher. But anyway, it is 43%. 81% of our landowners claimed renters of their land had no influence on the decisions that they made to participate in conservation cost share programs. One of our questions were, do you rent land? Do you lease the land to others? And if they do, who makes the decisions? Because we wanted to make sure we had the right people. So here, those that responded, 81% of them said the renters who they rent to don't influence them as far as conservation program participation. Okay, so we asked them, one of the first questions we asked them, have you heard the term ecosystem services before this survey? And what do you think the answer was? No. 57% of all respondents said they'd never heard the term before. And then those that that did answer yes, that they've heard the term ecosystem services, we asked them, well, what does this term mean to you? And we had a host, I think here we had 2, 4, 6, 8 different ecosystem services. So those that said they've heard the term ecosystem services before this survey, we said, okay, tell us what ecosystem services mean to you. And as you can see here, flood control was one of the least, with the most popular being wildlife habitat and purifying air and water. Now, one thing that we found very fascinating and interesting, look here on the bottom axis, it's in a percent. And
yeah, I can't do nothing. I can't do nothing.
And here, all these responses are less than 50%. So realistically, those folks who said they heard the term, when we asked them what it meant to them, they were still, there was no 100 or 75% that were for wildlife habitat. So it was still a little weak understanding of the overall term. But wildlife habitat and purifying air and water were the 2 most popular. Then we followed that up with what is your degree of familiarity with these 6 terms, with 1 not familiar and 5 very familiar. And you'll see that water quality and wildlife habitat came out at the highest on a scale of 1 to 3, with 3 being neutral, and anything below 3 would be not too familiar. And you'll see that water quality and wildlife habitat the most. But those of you that are in the state of Maryland, look here that there is very little knowledge or understanding of the term forest mitigation banking. And I know we have quite a few counties that have forest mitigation banking, but there's still not that strong of a familiarity with this particular term. Now, what we did in our survey is we started very general, and then we worked our way down to a little bit more down in the weeds to get more specific on questions. If there were a conservation program that offered you a payment for improving the quantity and or quality of ecosystem services on your land, would you participate in such a service? Yes. 54%, so a good over half said they would, but there was still a good portion, about 33%, that were kind of on the fence that said we're not quite sure. And then, you know, a small 13% that said absolutely not. And we break that out by tree farmer and farmers, and we found that tree farmers were more willing to participate than the farmers. So 64% of tree farmers would versus 42% of farmers said they would. And I take notice here that the don't knows, there were about a quarter of the tree farmers, but a good portion of the farmers were kind of on the fence where they really weren't too sure about this. And we'll explain this a little bit later on as we drill down more refined. So now we asked them, indicate your level of agreement with the following statement. I would be interested in enrolling in a conservation program that pays to produce and enhance benefits such as carbon, wildlife habitat, pollinators, biodiversity, water quality, and endangered species. So, you know, here the previous question really dealt more, would you participate in a general program? We didn't give specific ecosystem services, but here we broke specific services down. And we found out that water quality and wildlife habitat were the 2 most popular type of ecosystem services that they would be interested in participating in. And even with the pollinators, you look here, the scale is on a 50%. So overall, water quality, wildlife habitat were the most popular, followed by pollinators. And you'll see that we broke these down by tree farmers in the red and farmers in kind of the green. And we asked what we call the conjoint choice related questions. And here, and just bear with me, I know I just did a shot of this to kind of show you what the landowner received. But essentially here we gave a hypothetical situation, and basically this situation was that they were read or given a conservation program is being developed that takes the first step towards encouraging landowners and operator participation in emerging markets for ecosystem services. Guidelines are being developed to provide payments for these services. These involve voluntary programs that would give landowners the opportunity to receive payments for applying these practices on their properties. Now here we were testing three variables: program length, contract length, which would be vary between 5, 15, and 30 years. Program administration, who you're really going to be doing business with. And we had the federal government, federal agencies such as USDA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies such as the Maryland Department of Natural Resources or the Maryland Department of Agriculture, or non-governmental organization, NGOs. And the third really dealt with program payment, and the payments were $30, $70, $100, and $200 per acre per year. These rates were based upon what we received from National Ag Statistics on typical rental rates for farmland within counties, from a low of 30 to a high of about 175 to 200. Now, they read that statement, and then we gave them 5 examples. Example 1, they would handle this one just by itself and make a choice between program A, program B, or neither. And I'll explain program or example 1. So it had a contract length of 30 years, program administered by an NGO, and a payment level of 100. Program B, contract length of 15, administered by a state agency, and you would be paid $30 an acre. They had to make a choice between these two or neither. And then each, as you'll notice, like example 2, the variables are different. And then we go down to, let's see, look at example 4, where we kept the contract length 5 years both for the same for both program A and B. And then the administration, we changed between, we were testing between a state and a federal agency, with program A being receiving more than program B of $30. This is called conjoint choice. 5 different, we were testing for all those 3 variables. Really forced the respondent to think about what was important to them. And our analysis is like this. The respondents in general tended to prefer the status quo. Their first reaction was to reject these programs. But then as they started going and to say example 2, 3, 4, or 5, and thinking about these different attributes that would be there, higher payments did increase the probability of participation. And then as we looked at some of the regional differences, there were very few, but farmers on the upper eastern shore appeared to react more positively to financial compensation. Longer contract lengths decreased the probability of participation. So the shorter the contracts, the more people would participate. And we wondered, I mean, no big surprise to those of us that work with the agricultural and forest landowners, but this documents that you really need to have shorter contract lengths, particularly in our scenarios where we were looking at 30 years. And a lot of these could really be dealing with the uncertainty of future crop prices, or because the majority of the Maryland farmers and tree farmers are older, and thus they have shorter planning horizons. You know, that's what we could speculate on. Farmers prefer programs administered by NGOs. Now, remember what I was explaining to you before, you know, about the lack of trust with the University of Maryland and with the federal government and the state government. We think this particular finding has something to do with that. And this was also the same that we found in the contingent valuation that I'll talk about shortly. Tree farmers, on the other hand, prefer programs administered by the state and the federal government. they have really, apparently really good working relationships with the state and the federal organizations currently. Now when we asked them, of all these variables, contract length, program administration, and payment level, what was most important to them when making their choice? Contract length came out the most important. Now I point out the scale here. This is still on a scale of 1 to 5 with 1 not very important and 5 very important. So all 3 came out as very important, above 3, but contract length came out the most important, followed by payment level. And then we followed up and flat out asked them again to test to see, it's like, okay, who do you really trust? Who do you trust administering this program? Who do you want to do business with? And we gave them 4 choices: the federal government, the state, NGOs, or a private entity. And here we found that 34% preferred to work with the state and 32% preferred to work with the NGOs, followed by the federal government. Now the private, we threw this in because there was some interest in by some more private organizations to establish kind of a business structure where that could be funded through a crowd-type funding account. And through that crowdfunding account, it would in turn receive payments that this private organization could then give out to landowners for ecosystem service payments. But I think it didn't appear as if that was very popular. Needs a little bit more study. Now we go to the contingent valuation, kind of wrapping this up. Here we give them a scenario, and then this would be in parts of the mid-Atlantic. Animals such as bear, quail, you can read that, are part of the natural system, and the habitat's being lost. There's organizations and private businesses interested in ensuring many of these wildlife species survive. And they're trying to enlist the help of landowners and managers, in particular to focus on rare, threatened, and endangered species, such as the bald eagle, Delmarva fox squirrel, and bog turtles. And some organizations recognize the important role that private landowners play in conservation, wildlife conservation, and are considering the creation of voluntary programs in which landowners could receive payments to apply conservation practices for improving this habitat. So here we gave them a situation, and the situation focused specifically on wildlife with threatened or endangered species. So we were kind of testing here what their level of agreement or comfort level would be, and we thought that a lot of landowners are not too comfortable with threatened or endangered wildlife species. But anyway, we thought we'd test to see what their initial reaction was. And the reaction was relative, it was pretty positive, that they would consider, or it was a positive reaction to this particular type of program, with about 48%, a little under half, being favorable towards this, and then about 35% being a little bit neutral, needing a little bit more information. And then we break that out with tree farmers and farmers. And here you'll see that the tree farmers, about 56% of the tree farmers, which are in red, they were in more favor of this type of program than farmers. But still, there was about 37% of the farmers said they would. Although more farmers were neutral, they were still hedging a little bit on this. Then we said, okay, we're going to enter dollar values into this now. Before we just talked about program, what is your reaction? So here, we focused this question on wildlife, and we said that same thing. Suppose there's a program for endangered species. This hypothetical program would be administered by a private business or NGO. Contract length of 10 years, kind of in between the 5 and the 30 that we had before, and it would pay you 40, 75, 150, or 250 per acre for 10 years. Now, not everybody was given the same choices. 25% of our audience were given $40, 25 were given 75, so and 25 150, and 25% 250. So that these dollar amounts were equally distributed throughout our whole population. And we found that in this particular case with wildlife, you look here, the blue is the yes response. It appears here as if the dollar amounts do increase the probability of participation in a wildlife. And there were very, very few no's, but still a good portion of don't knows. But there was still a significant, it looked like there was a good indication of dollar values increase in participation. Okay, now we went to something that I'll call like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody likes clean air and clean water. So we threw this question out, and we said this hypothetical program would be administered by the state organization, such as Maryland DNR, same contract length. It would involve planting trees on crop, pasture, and fallow land, same per acre rates per year, equally distributed throughout the entire population. And what do you think the answer was? It wasn't quite as evident. Here, take notice, first of all, the previous wildlife, there was some of those were above 50% responses. None of these were above 50%. Matter of fact, if you look at the yeses, they're pretty well equally distributed throughout all the rental rates. So leads, and then the don't knows were dominant within each one. So this leads us to believe that for this particular type of program, we couldn't make any strong determination. There was no definite dollar impact for this particular one, and we think it's because it would involve planting trees on crop, pasture, and fallow land. That a lot of folks, particularly the farmers, really don't want to plant trees and take cropland out of production. But we're going to test that later on. And then we asked the respondents, what were the reasons that you said that you would not participate in these two previous programs? And the three most important reasons for not participating in those previous two programs were concerned about government restriction on property, not enough information, which shows like some of them were using don't know because they needed more information, and the other is they don't want to take land out of production. So those were the three most important reasons. Contingent valuation analysis, tree farmers appeared more likely to participate in programs than farmers, bottom line. As the percentage of income earned from farming increases, the probability of participating in a program decreases. So the more money you make, the higher the percent of your income from farming, the lesser probability you would be in entering these type of programs. Payment levels have a positive and significant impact on participation in programs to protect wildlife, but not on participation in programs intended to clean air and water, as we described earlier. Being located on the eastern shore, particularly on the upper shore, appeared to increase participation, especially for the farmers. And the reason why we think this is important, because we think maybe a higher portion of higher rental rates were distributed up there. We're not quite sure about that, but that's what we're speculating. Having heard the term, ecosystem services had a positive and significant impact on farmer participation when program details were provided, but when no details were provided, there was really a weak participation rate. So you would really have to give more information on a lot of these type of programs. So in summary, we felt that less than 50% of the respondents are familiar with the term ecosystem services, which kind of validates and follows suit with what the other three surveys found in North Carolina, California, and the Nature Conservancy. The most important reason to reject participation is the lack of information. This suggests that educational programs could increase knowledge about ecosystem services and acceptance in these programs. This is just a new idea to most landowners, and we really need to do a better job of educating them. Tree farmers appear more willing than farmers to participate. Tree farmers with a higher percentage of off-tree farm income are more likely to participate in these ecosystem service programs. And farmers with a higher percentage of farming income, less likely to participate. Location does not appear to influence. Yeah, there is a slight connection on the upper shore, but not very strong. Respondents in general are risk adverse. They really prefer shorter contract lengths, which is demonstrated in both our contingent valuation and conjoint choice. And it's very unfortunate that most of the ecosystem services, whether it's a mitigation program or a voluntary type ecosystem, have really long contract lengths. And this suggests that most of the farmers and the tree farmers that we survey prefer shorter. And payments appear to increase participation in these programs. Farmers, in general, prefer programs administered by NGOs. Tree farmers, on the other hand, prefer programs administered by state and federal government. There's strong evidence that suggests that having heard or familiar with the term increases the probability of participation and suggests that education on the topic really increases participation. And there's some slight evidence that the females, even though the majority of respondents were male, we still had a pretty significant response from females. The evidence that the more females, landowners, were more apt to participate in programs. The evidence also suggests that an additional $2 per acre per year for each additional year of contract would motivate landowners to engage in a program. The other would be an additional $27 per acre per year for doing business with a private corporation rather than with state or federal governments. And these are ones that, we get into some of the modeling. This is where these numbers came about. But I think here would be what this says is money, the more money that you provide, the more or the least risk adverse the participants would be. And particularly here, if a private business wanted to engage in a relationship with a farmer or tree farmer, they would have to be willing to pay more to do business with them because there's just that lack of trust or uncertainty with them. And the bottom line, I think, from this whole research effort is one size does not fit all. And this is really, really important, that programs need to be tailored to your audience. And those of us that have worked in the natural resource area for years understand this, that everybody has different objectives, motivational factors, and a lot of times when these programs are developed, it's like one size fits all. It's not flexible for meeting the multiple needs of many of the people we deal with. So here, I think our message is tailor your program to your audience. And with that, I think I'm pretty much done. Here's my contact information. If you want copies of the final report, it's on my webpage. Feel free to go there. It's in a PDF version. Or you can email me, and if you want a hard copy, I have hard copies I can send you, or if you want to talk to me about specifics, there's my phone number. So with that, that's pretty much all I have for today, Andrew. Not quite sure how to go from here, but I don't see any questions currently.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob. We've been having a wonderful time here at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. While you've been talking, Bob, we lost all phone and internet for about 35-40 minutes, and fortunately it came back on just as you were finishing up. So we were trying to scramble and figure out a way that we could get you to stretch a little bit, but your timing was perfect. So what I'd like to do for the folks who are still with us is to bring in some final poll questions, and then we can wrap things up, give people a chance to ask questions if they have any. So now that we've had a chance to learn a little bit more about ecosystem services, go ahead and give us some feedback on a scale of 1 to 5. Tell us how you feel about it, how much information you've gotten out of this. And I know this one's kind of an odd question, but we usually ask it just throw it out there. Give us an idea of how much this might be worth to you. For example, if you wanted to see this presentation and it was 20 miles away, would you go drive to see it? Or if it was 10 miles away, something like that. How much time and money would it take for you to expend to go to something? Does that include
if you drive a Prius or something, or a pickup truck?
Well, we also aren't assuming that gas is $2.65 or $3.65 or $6.65. It's a best guess, pretty much, and it's very subjective. And once again, we'll give you a chance, if you're interested in getting a copy of Bob's report, we'll give you a chance to type in your email or address here, and we can bring his contact information back up. Now, Tina writes in that she heard the entire presentation and it was awesome. Well, thank you for the feedback. Since it was being recorded on a different server rather than the one here at our building, it was being recorded on a server at College Park. I was assuming that most people were going to be able to see it, and so once I had a friend who was not in this building log on, she said, "Oh yes, he's talking. Everything seems good." Okay, and Anne would like to share the email address for the report with everyone. So what I'll do is bring Bob's contact information back up and give people a chance to see that. Once again, it's rtjaden@umd.edu, rtjaden@umd.edu, or 410-310-4690. And Donnell says, yes, I had no idea there was any problem with the host. Excellent, and the only way you would have known would be if I hadn't told you. So the wonders of technology came back just in time. So I'll give you a chance to ask any other questions if you have them. And once again, his email address, rtjaden@umd.edu. The phone number is 410-310-4690. And once again, if you don't have a chance to get all of that down, you can drop me a line as well at akling1, that's AKLING1, also at umd.edu. So we'll go back to the final polling, give people a chance if they need to write anything more down. Okay, we have a question coming in, or one of the participants is typing. A couple of people are typing, so we'll see what they have to say. Turpin Tree Farm says, we're more interested in reducing property taxes than receiving more income. And that's always an interesting perspective, and that, unfortunately, is something that is a little outside the scope of what we're doing. That's something that has to do with politicians rather than with researchers.
Right, but I I do think they bring up a interesting topic, because in the past, I know Dr. Laurie Lynch and I, probably about 15 years ago, did a similar survey asking what landowners need to engage more in conservation programs, and we asked them about property taxes, income taxes, incentives, and property taxes were a key motivational factor, even for those landowners who don't participate in something like if they have forest land, something like the Forest Conservation Management Act, where they do decrease some of their taxes based on that. But one interesting thing about this would be those of you that are on this and have known or are interested in a payment for ecosystem service program, one of the things I've been really raising a red flag with policymakers is, as programs are developed, we need to deal with those payments that the landowners receive so that they're not taxable. Because currently, if you would receive a payment for an ecosystem service, you'll receive a 1099 from either the federal, the state, or some other entity that you have that relationship with, and that is taxable income. And to this point, this whole area is so new that there's been very few policymakers that have really thought about or had time to really address how to handle these payments. And I know on the forestry and on the agricultural side, we have many different models or examples of how some of these cost share programs can be exempt or can be classified as special use. But I think I just throw that out there because I see there's some policymakers that are on this webinar, and I think we need to really keep this on the table, because if the landowner does have to pay taxes, depending on where their income bracket is, if they do receive an income, it's not going to be as good of a deal as they originally thought.
Okay, we don't seem to have...
Maybe that was more information than what a lot of people needed, but I just thought I'd
that's
throw
always
that
very
out.
helpful. Need to get as much background on some of these things as possible. Okay, I think we've covered all the questions. So once again, thank you, Bob, and this recording will be available for folks. We will be putting it on our YouTube channel, or you can go to extension.umd.edu/woodland and look in the webinar recordings. We'll have it there probably in the next couple of days or so. We have spring break at the University of Maryland coming up next week, so I want to get this taken care of before we break. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Bob, for helping out and running things while we were offline. And from the University of Maryland Extension and the Woodland Stewardship Education Program, this is Andrew Kling signing off, and have a very good day.